I think so.
Great. Hi, my name is Don Tebow. I'm the Executive Director of the OpenID Foundation, and thank you all for attending this workshop. Some of you were with us just a few minutes ago, where the OpenID Foundation and the U.S. Financial Data Exchange had a joint workshop regarding the Financial API Workgroup and our certification program. This is a series of workshops that the OpenID Foundation has been hosting over the course of the year to better educate communities of interest about the latest standards, OpenID Connect, FAPI, and elsewhere, and also to provide more information about our self-certification program. So for more information about the OpenID Foundation, please go to openid.net, and we also encourage your membership in the OpenID Foundation and your participation in OpenID Foundation work groups. While participation in a work group does not require a financial or other commitment, it does require some IPR protections, and your input is most appreciated as we form these very important standards that hold out the promise of global interoperability for not only financial APIs, but also what we've been calling the eKYC and Identity Assurance Standard. These standards, working with other work groups at the OpenID Foundation, form a holistic community, if you will. The work done in FAPI informs new evolutions of OpenID Connect. The certification program built for OpenID Connect and FAPI will be the basis for a similar certification effort for eKYC. At the same time, we're tightly coupled with other OpenID Foundation work groups like the Moderna work group, where together in collaboration with the GSMA, another workshop partner in September, we want to make sure that any changes in standards for OpenID Connect, for FAPI, for eKYC are highly anticipated and incorporated in the standards for the platform of choice, the mobile device. As I mentioned with the GSMA and others, that mobile standard continues under the Moderna work group, as the other work groups that are part of the OpenID Foundation community. This workshop, together with our colleagues in the UK at the Open Banking Implementation Entity, is one of a series that have preceded it and will continue, so that we can continue to offer all parts, all stakeholders in the ecosystem, a transparent opportunity to see what work is underway, what work's been accomplished, and also the extension of those standards into other industry sectors and scaling at internet scale for global interoperability. Let me hand the ball over to my colleague, Chris Michael, who'll be giving a couple of introduction comments and framing what we want to get accomplished in this workshop. Chris?
Thank you, Don. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Michael. I've been, for the last 4 years now, leading the development of the Open Banking Standard in the UK. And right from the word go, I think we were very keen not to reinvent the wheel, particularly on the security model and the security side of things. So we partnered with and have been working with the OpenID Foundation on the security profile.
I just had an appointment. I just came from the GP.
Sorry, for the last 4 years, and so where we've kind of got to now is the standard that we've kind of developed together really isn't just a UK standard. It's not just a European standard. It's becoming the kind of basis for standards globally in the space of open banking, and not just open banking, all financial products and other products which require the same sort of level of security that you would expect for financial products. So what we want to do today, I think, is share a little bit of the journey about where we've got to, and then really talk about the standards, both so the OpenID Connect and the FAPI standard that Nat's going to introduce. We're going to talk a little bit more about the FAPI and CIBA profiles, including some of the enhanced security and some of the new versions. So Dave Tong is going to introduce that. Freddie, from my colleague at the OBIE, is going to talk about the OBIE standard and where we've got to in terms of the different APIs, the different use cases. We've got a little bit of a discussion then around the kind of security and interoperability, and particularly the use of certificates and other directory services. And then we're going to move on to certification, conformance and certification. So Joseph Heenan's going to give us a demo of the conformance tool, the OpenID Foundation's FAPI conformance suite, and talk through the certification process. Glyn and Julian from the OBIE are going to talk through a similar certification tool and conformance tool and certification process that we've got for the functional APIs for the read-write responses. And then really we're going to open up to a Q&A and try and leave as much time as possible to hear from you and answer any questions that you've got. But I think, you know, we are still, I think, at the start of this journey globally. What we've seen in the UK is after quite a lot of, I suppose, issues that we saw in the early stages of open banking in the UK, we've got to a much better place now where quite a large number of banks have started to get certified to the standards, both to the FAPI profile and to the functional API standards. And we're seeing the results of that are a relatively high degree of take-up of open banking APIs, both in terms of third parties, regulated, authorized third parties being able to access those APIs and build services on top, and of actual customer adoption. You know, we are, I think, somewhere around about between over the last 2 years when the APIs have been live, we've seen a kind of pretty much exponential growth in the volume of API calls across not all of the banks, but across the CMA9, the 9 largest retail banks in the UK, who are required to provide statistics to the OBIE. We've seen a growth, it's almost exponential growth of up to, I think, close to 4 billion API calls across the CMA9 in that time period. Majority of that is account information, the read API, and that's been largely replacing screen scraping. So for things like business accounting packages, wealth management, personal finance management packages, loan applications, those sort of use cases where there is a requirement to get access to data from the accounts. But the really significant growth area is likely to be in payments now, payments initiation. And we're very much at the early stages of that, but payments initiation has certainly got a lot of potential. And it's not just about what is mandated and the regulatory requirements for banks. What we're seeing now in the UK is a shift from banks who started off with open banking because they were told to do it, and they had to do it from a regulatory point of view. But open banking now, these banks are looking at this as an opportunity to offer commercial services on top of these APIs. And I think something we were talking about earlier on today, a number of us, that what we expect to see is a much greater interest from banks in the whole topic of conformance and certification, as this moves from just being a regulatory requirement to being a commercial imperative and a commercial driver. And you know, when or if and so as and when, not if and when, as and when banks start to see the benefits of this as a commercial channel, we expect to see a much greater interest in conformance and certification. So I think that's kind of what I was just going to kind of introduce and set the scene, I suppose, and wanted to hand over to Nat now to talk through OpenID Connect and the financial grade API.
Thanks very much, Chris. May I get the screen, please?
You should be presenter.
You.
And you're not very loud.
You can now see it. Okay, looks good.
Yeah.
Good. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to introduce you guys to OpenID Connect and a little bit of FAPI as well. It may be a repeat to some of you who know OpenID Connect very well. But nevertheless, let me just go on through it. So while OpenID Connect is often said to be an authentication protocol, it is actually much wider than that. OpenID Connect, in its essence, is a selective claims provision protocol. One of the claim is about the authentication event. Then that can be used as the federated authentication. But OpenID Connect in general can cater much wider use cases, such as eKYC that Don has just pointed out. And OpenID provider, the server side, doesn't have to run by Google or somebody like that, but you can certainly run it by yourself on the cloud or on premise or even on your phone. And there's a special version of the OpenID provider called SIOP, SIOP, self-issued OpenID provider, which talks about how to implement it on your phone. Now, we say our catchphrase for OpenID is Internet Identity Layer. When we say identity, it actually means set of claims related to an entity. Often, people confuse between identity and identifier. But in the case of OpenID, identity actually is not identifier, but the set of claims, like you guys are seeing it on your screen. It's a set of claims or attributes about a user who got authenticated, which is expressed in terms of JSON. An identity layer actually provides who is the user that got authenticated, where was he authenticated, when he was authenticated, how was he authenticated, what attribute he can give you, or what claims he can give you, and why he is providing them. And all of these are the part of identity. And OpenID Connect is exactly the protocol that provides identity in an interoperable manner and simple and mobile friendly and secure and flexible. By interoperable, we mean standardized scopes like OpenID, profile, email, address, phone, and method to ask for more granular claims like request object and claims. Recently we've been having a new spec called RAR, which actually is something that builds on this idea of granular claims. And then ID token is a signed token which has information about the authenticated user. And there's another endpoint called user info endpoint, from which you can get attributes about the user, and also you can translate the tokens. Now, this user info endpoint may soon be expanded as well to accommodate some of the eKYC use cases. So keep watching. Now, by simple and mobile friendly, our predecessor, SAML, which is a very good spec, and a lot of us users it, and often I actually spoke in support of them. But one of the downside of SAML was XML and XML DSIG. So we learned from that, and we made it into JSON-based and REST-friendly instead of SOAP. And in simplest cases, it's just a copy and paste. Although the security property there it won't be so nice, but if the application is not that security conscious, you could as well do that. And it's also mobile and app friendly because that was a requirement to begin with. And by secure, we talk about scalable security. we can cater a very simple use case with low security requirements. Simple, we often say simple thing simple, but elaborate thing possible as well. In the case where there's low environmental control and you need to protect high value assets or resources, then you need to have a pretty secure protocol, and OpenID Connect actually provides all those. And by flexible, you can get granular, you can do a granular request to achieve collection minimization, and you can do something called aggregated claims, which in OpenID provider gets claims from other providers and assemble it into the ID token, or another mode called distributed claim, which I'm not going into today. But if you want to dig into it, just read OpenID Connect 1.0. It's an interesting feature. And then, like I told you before, a few minutes ago, choice of your provider as you like. Now, getting into FAPI. FAPI actually is a high security profile of OpenID Connect. So in the previous figure, I was showing that OpenID Connect can span all those 4 quadrants. But FAPI is aimed at medium to high security in the low environment control situation, such as on the internet. And FAPI version 1 is to become final specification later this year. It's formally verified for the its security properties, and it's used by Open Banking UK, and the Australian Consumer Data Standard went live on the 4th of July this year, a couple of weeks ago, but I hear that they are pretty much FAPI version 1, plus some features from FAPI version 2 as well. So FAPI version 2 is still in the making. We are streamlining FAPI 1.0. We're learning from our implementation experiences, and we have clearer security target, but yet to be formally verified. And we are targeting to get to the implementers draft status later this year. So as far as timeline is concerned, FAPI version 1.0 is slated to become final specification, final standard by the end of this year. And this is the proposed timeline. Working group last call before August 31st. And then, if we get any more comments during that period, we'll get the comment to be resolved in comment resolution meeting around September 14th. Then we submit the draft to the Foundation Secretary on September 21st, and it should go to the public review period by September 28th, which is 60 days to be in compliance with WTO rulings. And if we gain more editorial comments, then we'll resolve them in the CRM meeting at the end of the November, and voting for the final specification starts at around December 4th. Now this voting is going to be 14 days. And if we started on the December 4th, the voting ends on December 18th. And in that case, the publication will be ready before your holiday. For FAPI version 2, if we get to the working group last call by September 15th or something like that, then I'm not going to read it out, but the public review, since it's shorter, it's only 45 days, will be in the same kind of situation with FAPI version 1, but instead of being a final, it's going to be an implementer's draft. For those of you who don't know what implementer's draft is that this is the IPR locked down version of the specification. So even if you implement it, you won't have to be worried about getting sued over IPR or something like that. So that's a very important milestone. Also, I have to talk about conformance tools in global context. The specs are good, but they are written in human language, and as human language has some vagueness in it associated with it, it has some variabilities in interpretations. And this often causes problems in interoperability, and we have seen them amply even in the open banking space. Also, spec being secure and implementation being scarce is not the same thing. We need to test that the implementation is configured correctly or written correctly. So these two requirements drive us to something called Conformance Suite. And OpenID Foundation is providing FAPI version 1 Conformance Suite that you guys can use it in your CDCI pipeline as well. By the way, I have to actually credit Open Banking implementation entity for kindly providing their code base for this version 1 testing. And as we get to the version 2 implementer's draft, we probably want to start thinking about creating conformance suite for version 2 as well. And we are, calling for sponsors to do that. So that's all from me. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take.
Hello. My name is Domenica Nelli. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I usually run the FAPI because I'm working in a financial institution in the UK. And I have two questions for you. The first one, how many times I have to run the FAPI Conformance Suite? I don't know if there is some recommendation about that.
So Chris probably can answer that better than I do, but running the tests is I recommend you to test, put it into your CDCI pipeline and run the tests quite often during the development period. For submitting for the conformance, the generally recommended pattern is to do it every time when you have substantive change in your implementation, and at least once a year. That's what I heard from Chris. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's so in the UK, there is a requirement for the 9 largest banks, the CMA 9, to run the conformance tools and to recertify whenever there is a significant change that would affect security. And under any event to recertify every 12 months. So that's a requirement for the CMA 9 and a very strong recommendation for everyone else. And I think that recommendation makes sense as a general sort of guideline. In different markets, we are seeing different approaches to open banking. I expect that in some markets there will be, well, we've seen no specific mention across Europe under PSD2. There is no mention of certification per se. It remains to be seen what happens in other markets that adopt or are adopting open banking, whether it's a mandatory requirement or not. But good practice, I would suggest, would be what I've suggested. You know, to Nat's point, really, you should be running the conformance tool as part of your pipeline. In any case, it would help you reduce risk and reduce errors. You know, this is a very specialized thing, and this software is designed to test lots of different things. So I would very strongly recommend that. And then I would strongly recommend recertifying every year at the very least. And then whenever you've made a significant change. Joseph's just posted in the chat, by the way, some instructions on or some examples on the configuration for a fully automated test.
Yes, maybe thank you a lot for the reply. That's really useful for me. The second is much more technical question because I'm not sure. I tried to configure it for the first time. FAPI. We use ping federate and ping access like identity and security authorization provider. And my question is much more technical because I understood that we have to set up the public key in the well-known configuration in OBIE PKI. But for what about the signing key, we can create a fake signing certificate.
Yeah, so if it depends where you are and how your APIs are configured. If you are if you're on ASPSP and you're testing and you're using the UK Open Banking Directory, then you can create certificates and software statements just to be used for testing, run the tests, and then revoke those certificates, those private keys, if you want to do that. That's an option that you get with the UK Open Banking Directory. If you are in other markets, you could take a similar approach. You would just need to make sure that, you know, if you're trying to test and certify a live production environment, to some extent it is down to you how you provide access. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, because I use OBI. We are in OBI market and we are a ASPSP provider. So thanks you.
Any other questions? Sorry, guys, that I looked like, you know, touched the volume for mic, you know, without knowing that my voice was very soft, but hopefully you can hear now much better.
Thank you, Nat. It's Roshan Daryanani here from Nationwide Building Society in the UK. Are you, Nat, or anyone else on the call able to clarify the position on charging for conformance certification? As I understand it, we can run the tests from the OIDF environment against our production environments for free, but to issue the certificate of conformance, there is a charge. Is that an annual charge? Is it a per issuance charge? How does that work?
So it's per certification, so per filing.
Okay. So that would be a charge every time the certificate is issued. But coming back to Chris's point, if we were to run the conformance test for each release or each impacting release, that could be monthly, and charges monthly would soon build up over the period of a year and longer. Coming back to Chris's point, and I guess this is more directed at Chris, would it still be a requirement to get the certificates reissued every month, or is a certificate required annually, perhaps with the retest every month and self-attestation?
Yeah, so this, I mean, this is something that applies specifically to the CMA 9, And the requirement, as it's been stated, is whenever there's a material change, it will affect the security. So there is some degree of flexibility in there. I would say if you are running material changes that affect the security every month, that's certainly that wasn't our understanding. I mean, there have been cases up until now where ASPSPs, not just CMA9, have been making quite a lot of changes. We were expecting that there would be more stability than that around the security layer, and it would be more the functional API elements that might change. But I think that if it's going to become something that you're doing every week or every month, then I suppose that's a discussion between you and the trustee or the office of the trustee in the UK. I didn't come up with these requirements, so that's something that's come from the office of the trustee, and I'm just repeating what has been mandated in that regard. But I would suggest if it's likely to cause a challenge, then it's something that you should take up with them directly, I suppose.
Okay, thank you very much both for the responses. Appreciate that.
Hi, I've got a question. It's Kashyap Sangani from Santander in UK. Just wanted to know more about, it's mainly from open banking perspective. So if we have the refresh tokens at the moment, obviously they are long-lived compared to access tokens. What is the guidance in terms of OpenID Foundation in terms of long-lived refresh tokens? So see if a refresh token is valid for 2 years if you want to implement that. What are the recommendations and from security perspective, and is it quite common for banks to do that or other organizations to do that?
I wonder if maybe Freddie Gara, if you're Freddie, you.
So yeah, I can offer a few insights. I don't think there's anything that's stated in the FAPI standards as such around the length of the refresh tokens. In general, when you issue a token, you want to ensure that the token has sufficient entropy within itself so that it cannot be guessed within the period of time that's issued. So the longer it is valid, the more entropy it needs to have. Now, in the UK open banking situation, all tokens are certificate bound, and it's the same case with FAPI. Now, when you try to use the refresh token at the token endpoint, the token endpoint itself is protected either through private key job or through MTLS, which means just losing the refresh token or the refresh token being stolen by an attacker poses a limited threat to the identity provider. Now that's one side of the coin. The second thing that you should consider is that you could have a rotating refresh token, because the longest that an access token is going to survive is 90 days because of the current RTS rules. Every 90 days, you're going to have the TPP come back to your token endpoint to issue a new access token. And you could rotate the refresh token at that point of time. And that might just be a nice, secure way of operating rather than issuing unduly long refresh tokens.
Okay, and if we have to issue a long refresh token, is the revoke endpoint mandatory then to revoke the refresh token if the TPP wants to, for any reason?
Not by the standards. Again, all these things are belt and braces solutions, right? We cannot predict the kind of attacks that might take place and what kind of situations might arise that would cause you issues with a 2-year with a refresh token that's valid for 2 years. And that's why there's standard industry practice, and there are certain things that you simply avoid so that you don't face unknown situations like this.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So maybe there's Brian Campbell or somebody who's got first-hand knowledge about that. But in some implementations, refresh token is actually refreshed every time it is used. So it's get rotated as soon as you use refresh token. So that that's in the case of the bearer refresh token. Well, not really bearer, but because you actually have to send the client credentials as well. But that's another way to look at it. But it's all risk-based. You have to evaluate the risk.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm Balaji from Santander. Same thing. I just want to clarify one thing. In case of the refresh token, we have the OBIE specification saying, in case if you are issuing the a long run of refresh tokens, yeah, like 10 years or 15 years, yeah. So in that case, you are expecting each time you want to issue the new refresh token, or you want to use the same refresh token?
I don't think the OBIE specifications state anything about how refresh tokens should be managed. To be clear, we defer all the security profile related bits to the FAPI profile now, and that's really the font of all the knowledge around security and conformance around security.
Because, oh yeah, yep. Sorry, yep, go on.
So, and I think I'm quite familiar with what FAPI states. I don't think there's any statements around the length of the refresh token.
I don't think so either.
In case of issuing because each API depending on the lifetime of refresh tokens, consider the CBPAI, confirmation of funds, yeah. They're expecting, they want to come to us as long as they want to keep the refresh token. How can we maintain the token lifetime TTL? How can we define the lifetime of the refresh token in that cases?
So if I could just jump in, this is Dave Tongs, I'm the co-chair of FAPI working group. So I mean, I think it's quite important principle really to separate out any sort of policies that may need to be applied, whether for legislative reasons or whatever, and then kind of an authorization and sort of API security profile. So I would strongly recommend not to tie refresh token lifetimes into any sort of legislative requirement at all. Refresh tokens don't have to have any expiry. They can last forever and they could be revoked at any time. So you don't even need to put any expiry on it at all. In FAPI, we don't require that refresh tokens are rotated. We do require that they are the client authentication used when that refresh token is used is uses mutual TLS or some other sort of key-based authentication. So you've got your protection there, that refresh token itself cannot, even if it for whatever reason to leaked, it wouldn't be able to be used without the private key.
So as per the open banking standards and the endpoints, we don't have any endpoint saying revoke the access token or refresh token endpoint. Yeah. In this case, who is responsible to revoke the access token? Is it the ASPSP or TPP?
So there's a few reasons that access can be revoked, and separate out access tokens and refresh tokens. So if from the the actual end user and they want to revoke it at the bank side at the SPSP, then that mechanism is completely out of bound from the standards, and whether a particular token is invalidated or just a record in the database is changed is kind of that's up to an individual implementation. From the other side, if access wants to be essentially revoked from the client, yes, that is where we need interoperable standards. And there is already an existing kind of RESTful endpoint to manage the consent for AISP requests that you can issue a delete RESTful request to. So already in the open banking standards, there is something to do that. Yes, in a more kind of, OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 standards-based way, that would be the kind of token revocation endpoint. But seeing as there's already a RESTful endpoint which supports this kind of lifecycle operations and open banking, then I think that, I don't know if Chris or Freddie would disagree, but I would recommend that is the one that should be used.
Yeah, in that case, yes, obviously we have the revoke endpoint at the rate of consent level. Yeah, I can get the consent ID, I can revoke. In this case, yeah, I can keep on issuing the tokens to the TPPs, right? Even if I revoke the consent.
So in the specific CBPI case, there are a couple of things that that OBIE that the OBIE standard provides that you can leverage. So one of the things that we've added, and it's a little non-standard, but we couldn't find anything corresponding in the OpenID Connect standard, is the ability to specify in the ID token as a claim the expiry time of the refresh token. So once the refresh token is issued, the TPP knows when that refresh token is expected to expire, which means that the TPP could rotate that refresh token simply by hitting the token endpoint and getting a new access token and a new refresh token before that expiry event occurs.
Yep.
And that's a simple, straightforward method for issuing refresh tokens that are time bound. Now, again, there is nothing stated in any of the standards which say that a refresh token should be valid for a specific length of time. This is a risk-based decision that each ASPSP has to make, and it depends completely on their organizational policies and the risk appetites. But the tools are there if you decide that I'm going to have a refresh token that's valid just for 15 days. You've got the tools in place to be able to rotate that refresh token and the access token without disrupting the TPP and the PSU's operations.
Sure.
And that's the important bit over there. That the CBPI consent is a forever lived consent as such. And if you were to go back after 90 days and ask the PSU to re-authenticate, that may be viewed quite negatively by the regulator.
Okay. Yeah.
Just in the interest of time. Sorry, just in the interest of time, because we're running a bit behind now, and we've got quite a long session. Can I just move this on? If you've got any more questions, there'll be other opportunities to ask these questions. In fact, some of the questions you may have will be answered before you ask the questions. Alternatively, please use the chat. Sorry to interrupt, but we do need to move this on. Dave, I'm just going to hand over to you now.
One last question. Sorry, Chris. One last question. So we are obviously based on the consent dates, not based on the refresh token date and time, right? Expiries. Just to finally confirm.
Let's take the detail of this offline. You can reach out to us directly, but quick answer to the question is no. It's based on the issuance time of the token, and we moved away from the idea of specifying the seconds to expiry, and the expiry time of the refresh token is stated as an absolute date time.
Oh, yep. Thank you, guys. Thanks.
Okay. So, yeah, sorry about that, guys. So I'm just going to hand over to Dave now, who's going to talk a little bit more about FAPI and CIBA.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Is it possible to get permission to share my screen?
Sure, one moment, please.
Just while Daniel's doing that, then just to start off, really. So Nat's given the kind of intro to kind of OpenID Foundation, and we've heard also about some of the work with open banking and Fappy in particular. Great. Go-to meeting is going to need me to restart. Just a sec. Just a sec, I'll be back in 5 seconds.
So while Dave's doing that, just to remind everyone, please do keep an eye on the chat. Joseph's posted some useful notes around the conformance tests and answer the question from Gurdeep around the IDA certificates. Yes, certainly it would make sense, and this was a point I mentioned earlier as well, bearing in mind the cost of the IDA certificates. If you want to use specific certificates for testing, then self-signed certificates or some other form of certificates provided by the Open Banking Directory. That there are a number of options that you've got, but yes, I think the cost of the IDA certificates would make it not necessarily the best option to use for testing purposes.
Hi, yeah, I'm back now. Yeah, Daniel, if you could just give me the permission again, this time my Mac should let me. But just while that's happening, yeah, so look, I'm gonna try not spend too long. Okay, yeah, I'm struggling with that. Let me just talk through some of the relevant parts really, and I might just put a few links on chat, and I think that's probably going to be the easiest way rather than restart again. So yeah, Fappy, I suppose, has been started back in 2016 really as a working group, and just to kind of very quickly take you through some of the timelines really. Yeah, it started in 2016, and initially there were some specifications contributed from Intuit in the States, the Durable Data API, but quite soon as a working group we decided to focus on the actual and they covered the schemas as well as the security side of things, and we decided to focus on the security profile in particular. In 2017, kind of the liaison was established with UK Open Banking, and we began to focus on work on the read and read-write profiles for financial APIs, and as well as work with the UK. There was outreach to Japan, Australia, the States, a wider outreach across Europe with PSD2 and beyond. As all this work was going on, in 2018, we actually changed the name of the documents from, rather than just being financial APIs, being financial grade APIs. And that was really to reflect the fact that actually, this is really just a secure profile of OAuth 2 with some really kind of quite belt and braces approach. So, in terms of the actual specifications, really taking people through sort of line by line, you should do this, you shouldn't do this, in a way that actually made it a bit easier than some of the other specs to maybe test. And so, as Nat mentioned, we have this suite of conformance tests, and I saw in the chat, as well as conformance tests for for OpenID providers, authorization servers, there are also conformance tests for clients as well. And so that work's been underway, and kind of, I suppose what I'm just going to touch on briefly really in this segment is just where we're going. So essentially we ended up with this read and read-write profile where most of our attention has been. And again, in case anyone's not familiar with them, if I share with you just the links, everything there is in public Bitbucket. It's all open. We have an issue tracker as well. So I've just put the kind of main read profile on the chat, and I'll put the read write as well. And so just it's all there in kind of public Bitbucket. Anyone can access. You can see our issue tracker there is also public, and you can see the different pull requests and everything that that's been happening in the open really. But as part of that discussion, what we started realizing was that while the specification was very useful, it provided that kind of additional security. Nat talks about the fact that OAuth 2 is a framework. Even the specification, it talks about it being a framework. And so what Fappy aims to do is essentially have a profile of that, which is for situations that require higher degrees of security. But what we realized, well, there are a number of things we realized. One is that we needed to have a more defined security model. So there are a lot of kind of extra features that we added for good security reasons, but we realized we needed to really be able to tie these back to specific kind of properties of an attacker that we're trying to prevent against, and specific attacks we're trying to prevent. And part of this was really aided by the work of Daniel and the team, and there was a formal analysis of Fappy, and that was actually really helpful in also what we don't want to do is have kind of clauses in there which are just security theatre, but don't actually protect against any real attacks, or we're not quite sure what their value is in being there. And so we've begun some work in the Fappy working group to define some the attacker model, and again quite influenced by the formal analysis work that was done. And as a result of that, what we decided in the end really was that especially with the help of Daniel, we've come up with kind of a starting point for that attacker model, and it does actually kind of quite closely correspond with the existing FAPI specifications. But what we realized after doing that work, and with some of the newer specifications that were out, that actually we need to start work on almost the next version of FAPI. So FAPI 1.0, as Nat mentioned, we are hoping to get that to the final version this year, and that there really won't be any or shouldn't be any breaking changes in that, and that's what this kind of existing conformance test suites are around. But FAPI 2.0 is where we actually want to have this kind of very well-defined security attacker model, and actually have a bit of a simpler specification in the end. It will be have more features, because, and I'm going to touch on that in a minute, there's kind of additional features that we've worked on in the Fappy working group. But also in some ways it will be simpler. So for example, we've also kind of taken the decision to move away from read and read write, and rather move towards kind of a baseline and an advanced profile, because actually for some scenarios, for example the health scenario, read access is very sensitive, and so actually the difference between read and read write is a bit of an arbitrary kind of difference in terms of read can sometimes need just as much security as a read write API. And so the basic profile actually, in some ways, our hope is that it will be easier for implementers to implement, because it doesn't require message signing. So yes, it will require sender constrained tokens, but actually through the use of PAR, which is pushed authorization requests, we get a lot of security benefits, which mean that actually we don't need to do all of the signing on the front channel. And so there is, and again, I would just encourage you, if you have an interest in this at all, to please take a look. So I'm going to, again, just put a couple more links, which are just from our public repository. So I put there the attacker model, and this is we're just trying to finish off at the moment the 1.0, but as soon as we finish that off, I think the working group's focus will be on 2.0. And so I put the attacker model there and the baseline profile in, and in the baseline profile, it's quite helpfully a bit of a table partway through, which goes through the differences to FAPI 1.0. And again, you'll see that there's some things that we don't need. We don't need to use shash. We don't need to use the code ID token response type. We don't need ID tokens as detached signatures. We don't need request objects in the same way. So, but the nice thing is we'll be able to guarantee the same, or in some ways, increased levels of security. And so you could say, then why do we need the advanced profile? Well, the advanced profile is really to provide non-repudiation. So the security guarantees of the the main attacker model that we want to guard against, which again you can read in the link I've posted, we will protect against that with the baseline model. But if you want non-repudiation for certain parts of the authorization flow, that's when we have in the advanced profile, and that will then involve message signing. So look, that's some of what we're working on as a working group. And but just to and I'll finish in a little bit so that I can give time for questions. As well as this work on FAPI 1 and FAPI 2, the FAPI working group, really, I suppose it's open for anyone to join. As Nat mentioned, kind of there is an agreement to be signed just for IPR reasons, but actually the work, we hold on Atlantic time zone kind of weekly calls and Pacific bi-weekly calls. And some of what we work through, I suppose, are people who are using OAuth 2 now for these kind of quite advanced and quite secure purposes, seeing where we need extensions to the OAuth and OpenID Connect suite of standards. And so, as part of the work that happened, in the FAPI working group, things were already underway and people are already using mutual TLS in an OAuth context. But actually, the requirement that we really needed it for UK open banking meant that Brian and the other authors were able to really push along the OAuth mutual TLS standard, which is now RFC 8705. So while that wasn't developed by the FAPI working group, actually some of the members of the FAPI working group are authors of that, and it was very much kind of we were one of the people pushing for it to happen, I suppose, and that's one of a number of similar standards. So for example, CIBA, which for those of you who are at the OAuth Security Workshop the last couple of years, I think I've given a few presentations on that, which is client-initiated back-channel authentication. And so that was originally developed in the Moderna working group at OpenID Foundation. But we've, again, as part of FAPI, some of the members of FAPI working group, we joined the Moderna working group. We helped to push the draft forward and get it to its current version. And again, very happy to take any questions, later or offline. But CIBA can enable decoupled flows. So, where the user kind of grants authorization out of bound, maybe on a mobile phone, or it might be on a tablet. So it's often designed for places where, for example, you're at a point of sale terminal and you're not going to try and authenticate using whatever your identity provider is directly on some point of sale terminal. So we need some decoupled mechanism for that authorization to take place. And just a few others, and before I finish. So we also, I suppose, one thing to call out, although the FAPI is kind of within the OpenID Foundation, and that's been a great place for us to kind of work and have the resources to kind of move things forward. It's not a kind of OpenID Connect based specification. It's not, the idea is not that it's just it's purely an extension to OpenID Connect. And so, at the moment we do require some things. Well, we have required some things which are defined in OpenID Connect, for example, like the request object. But actually, a lot of these things we've tried to push forward. Again, the authors, members of FAPI working group are often authors of standards, kind of in the IETF OAuth working group. And so, for a long time, the OAuth JAR, the JOT Secured Authorization Request standard, has been moving forward, and it's very nearly there. And so the idea is that once that becomes a full standard, that actually we will remove the requirement for request object even in FAPI 1.0. So I suppose it's not, and that's just to kind of clarify that misconception that sometimes people think it's just about OpenID Connect, and yes, it does utilize some of the mechanisms defined in OpenID Connect, but it's not really about that. It's about a secure profile on top of OAuth 2, really. And so just a few of the other ones then. There's also in the working group we worked on Jarm, which is the JOT Secured Authorization Response Mode, which, yeah, again, it's just all there in the public Bitbucket repo, and again that allows us to kind of have signed authorization responses. Also work, initially in the FAPI specs, those of you who might have been reading them a while ago, we had a request object endpoint, and actually we've now sort of taken that out of the spec, and rather members of the working group are are working on the pushed authorization requests or PAR standard. And again, we're doing that actually within the IETF OAuth working group. Along with that, there's RA, which is rich authorization requests, which really enabling much greater level of detail. So for example, in UK open banking, there is we talked about just a little bit earlier, there's kind of essentially a separate API for managing what permissions a user wants to grant access to, because it needs a more richer language than just string-based scopes. And so actually, work is underway to kind of create a more interoperable standard around that. So look, I will stop talking now, but that's hopefully just a little bit of an introduction, an overview of some of the things that we're working on in the FAPI working group. And it would be great, if you're maybe new to this, or maybe in your work you actually do need to interact with the FAPI specs. It would be great to for you to join the working group. If you can't join all the calls, then again, welcome comments on the issue tracker. There's a mailing list which you can join, which you can also reply to. So again, just to say, it's a very, we're an open forum, and all the decisions are sort of tracked through, and you can see in the issue tracker on Bitbucket. But yeah, that's a bit of an overview, and I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Dave, I think you've comprehensively covered everything. But any questions before we move on? Okay, thanks, Dave. I'm going to hand over now to Freddie. Daniel, I wonder if you can give Freddie Gara the control. Here we go. Freddie's going to talk a little bit more about the kind of read-write OBIE spec. And as I said, if you've got any questions, jot them in the chat. We can answer them as we go, or we can have a session after this. Over to you, Freddie.
Hi, thank you for that. I hope I'm audible.
Yep, all good.
All good. Okay, great. So hi, I'm Freddie Guerra. I'm the standards author for the ReadWrite API specification of the UK Open Banking entity. I work as part of the standards team there. And I just wanted to use this session to do a very quick update of the state of play with the UK Open Banking standards. We now stand at version 3.16. Our standards are all available from the standards website. Link on the page. I will paste it in chat as soon as I'm done as well. And I believe we are one of the most comprehensive standards around open banking, definitely in the UK, most likely in Europe, and probably in the world. And the standard covers stems from the requirements of the CMA order and PSD2, and covers mainly 4 main functional areas and 1 area that kind of elbows its way into the OpenID Connect world. For the AIS side of things, the standard provides data exchange mechanisms and resource definitions for all of the resource types that we've listed out. I'm not going to rail through them, but that's pretty much what you would find on a standard payments account, on most payment accounts, and probably beyond just payment accounts. We have a fairly comprehensive approach towards payments. Very early on, we picked up the principle of making our payments agnostic of the payment rail that is used, but aligned to the type of payment that is that we are trying to make. So it covers both domestic and international or cross-border payments. Payments can be immediate or future dated. And we also have APIs that allow for standing orders, both domestic and international standing orders, to be set up. And then finally, we support the creation of bulk payments or file-based payments, as some like to call them. We have the ability to address the CBPII requirements in PSD2 through the creation of consents and then subsequent APIs for checking funds. And the extension beyond the core PSD2 use cases is the ability to provide callback mechanisms both for individual and bulk events. And this is built out through the adoption of SET as an events mechanism. We have on top of that defined some specific event types and some methods for subscribing to certain events. And that gives us the ability to extend the API and resource definitions to push events out. The final area that that the specifications cover is the dynamic client management side of things. This builds upon the dynamic client management protocol provided by OIDC or an extension to OIDC, but bakes in a more standard approach towards using software statements and the fact that we use mutually authenticated TLS as a way of identifying the party that's trying to register. The current version of the dynamic client management spec has been expanded, so it is no longer tied to the UK open banking directory, but allows you to extend the specification to use EI dashboard based onboarding, as well as onboarding using other trust anchors and other directories that might be available in the market. Short pause for breath and questions. Okay, I'll move on. So one of the things that has been discussed many times and has come up a number of times is what happened to the OBIE security profile, and should we be using the OBIE security profile or should we be using FAPI? Let me make it absolutely clear. The OBIE security profile was something that we created right at the beginning of time as we know it, because FAPI was still being worked upon, and this was before the first implementers draft of FAPI was available. We are no longer in that situation. We have a very stable security profile with FAPI 1.0. We no longer support and we no longer maintain the OBIE security profile. And we would very strongly encourage all ASPSPs to move off that. We would very strongly discourage any ASPSPs from implementing the OBIE security profile now. It was very much a stepping stone security profile, which was meant to be transient in nature. If we look at the differences between what the OBIE security profile does and FAPI, there are a few key areas. The OBIE profile was the more permissive of the two. There are a number of things that were allowed by the OBIE security profile which are turned off by FAPI. No more do we recommend the use of or even permit the use of RS-256 as a signing algorithm. The old profile allowed for the use of authorization code grant rather than the hybrid flow. And we certainly wouldn't like to see that being used any longer. I know Dave just described some of the changes where ID token is no longer or will not any longer be required for bindings. And in that case, again, of course, the authorization code grant rather than the hybrid flow would suffice and meet the requirements over there. But till we get to that point, that's where we are. FAPI is quite prescriptive about the client authentication mechanisms on the token endpoint. The old security provided profile allowed the use of symmetric secrets or shared secrets, which is a big no-no. So no more using client secret basic or client secret jot. And then the old profile allowed the use of query parameters outside of the request object, whereas FAPI now very clearly states that these parameters must move into the request object. There are a couple of similarities, though there are differences in the details. The ID token, the access tokens in the OBIE security profile were token bound, were holder of key bound as well. But we didn't have any specific RFC or method for those bindings, whereas FAPI very clearly states that the MTLS specification, which is now a full-fledged RFC in its own right and in great time, is the mechanism that's used for that, and provides for a few additional pieces like discovery endpoints and so on and so forth. That in a nutshell is things that we'd like to make very clear are great reasons to move off to FAPI and stop using the old OBIE profile. The next topic I'd like to cover is what's now available with the new dynamic client registration capability. We provide for a number of ways to register TPPs using the 3.3 DCR specification. The ecosystem has a mix of certificates that are available or can be used. Traditionally, we approach things from the viewpoint of a OB issued certificate, what we now call the legacy OB certificates. And then the ecosystem moved to OBIE issued certificates, which looked, felt, and smelt like EIDAS certificates, but were not EIDAS certificates in the sense that the shape of the certificate was the same as what you'd expect from a EIDAS certificate that followed the ETSI profile. So you can now use dynamic client registration using ETSI standard certificates, whether they are OBIE WACs or proper Q WACs. These can be hosted inside the directory JWKS. But if they are not registered with the OBIE directory, then the standard doesn't cover them. That does not preclude the ability to create extensions which would allow you to function in that manner. The other area is around signing certificates, and again, the OBIE directory provides for roughly, I'd say, 3 ways of doing things. You could either mint OBWAC or OB seal or a legacy OB signing certificate. You can upload a EIDAS QCLC, or you could upload the public part of a key pair. Now, this meets the non-repudiation requirements. OBIE will hold on to those keys even after they're revoked. And that gives you some strong non-repudiation even years down the line if you ever had to prove that. Again, the specification as it's written addresses the situation where where the DCR payload is signed using one of these lodged signing certificates, signing keys. But if it's not a lodged signing certificate or signing key, then you would need an extension to the specification to be able to do that. Any questions that I can address at this stage?
Yes, I have some question for you. We issued an ADA certificate both for transport and for signing. So the first question is, as ASPSP that we operate in UK, we need to have ADA certificate for signing purpose.
So I'll try not to veer into my interpretation of PSD2 and the RTS. I'll explain what my understanding is, but eventually this is something that you need your legal counsel to provide you counsel on. So the last clarification from the FCA around, I think, the March timeframe said that it was perfectly legitimate to identify TPPs using OBIE issued certificates, as long as the TPPs have provided evidence that they are in possession of an EIDAS certificate. Now, that clarity does not extend to stating whether that needs to be a QWAC or a QCLC. That's one element. The second element of my answer is that the RTS requirement to identify the party using an EIDAS certificate applies to TPPs. It does not apply to ASPSPs. ASPSP does not need to use an EIDAS certificate to identify itself to the TPP. That's a one-sided requirement. There is a EBA clarification which encourages ASPSPs to use EIDAS certificates, but it still doesn't state that as an absolute requirement. And please, if anyone has a counter view of this, please do put up your hand and stop.
Yeah, my understanding. Oh, sorry. Say, please go.
One thought before.
Sorry, I was just going to corroborate what Freddie's just said. That there is, however, a proposed ETSI standard around EIDAS certificates for message signing, and there may be some changes around the way that messages are signed, which may require EIDAS certificates to be used for ASPSPs for message signing, but that is still something that is to be clarified. But yes, I would definitely corroborate what Freddie said. You know, there is no hard requirement that can be found in the legislation that I'm aware of that requires ASPSPs to have an EIDAS certificate when acting in the role of an ASPSP.
I think that's an important differentiator. Yes. I'd just like to make one third point as well about signing certificates. If you're using signing certificates for the purposes of signing rather than identifying yourself as a TPP, as an ASPSP, as Chris said, and as I had interpreted as well, you don't need an EIDAS certificate. Even as a TPP, if you're using a signing certificate for the act of message signature and non-repudiation, rather than as an act of identification, you do not need to use a EIDAS certificate for that. Now, again, these are all things that are open to interpretation, and different organizations will reach different legal positions on this, but that's our current understanding.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And I'm so sorry, but I have another question for you, because sure. we issued the two certificates, so for transport and for signing for message signing. The problem that we have that when we upload the certificate, the signing certificate inside the OBI directory, it seems that OBI calculated the KID in different way for OB seal certificate than from QSEAL certificates. I mean, the kid is in the case of ADA certificate is the X5T, but for a normal open banking certificate is the KID ID.
Okay, so I think there's a little bit of I'll talk about two things: what the KID is now and what it should be, and what it might be once the rules come about. If you look at the JWS specification and the definition of KID, and Nat's on the call, so, or at least was, so he might be able to throw some more light on this. The KID is just a key ID. The fact that a lot of libraries or some of the libraries compute the KID using a certificate hash is besides the point. At the end of it all, it's an identifier, however it is arrived at. I recollect that in the early days there was some means. I think we used a hash of the certificate to arrive at the KID. But this doesn't mean that that the KID is something that's computed in a specific way, or there's a standard which states how the KID should be computed. Now, as we go ahead into the future, the PRETA signature standards do predicate that the KID is basically the SHA-2 hash of the certificate. So it's basically the X5T hash 256. So yeah, this is more of a implementation question of what the directory has gone and done. I don't believe it's gone and done anything incorrect. It does introduce some complexities around how these are handled and used in the marketplace, but this isn't a standards issue.
Well, I don't think so, because right now we are suffering an issue about the ADA certificate itself, because for the OBIE certificate, if you can see in the JWKS, you can see that KID ID is the same of X5T. And for the ADA certificate, it's not true. So the KID is quite different from the X5T. And so it creates some problem when we have to upload the certificate inside our PIN federated, I mean, in our authentication server, because it's calculated the KID like the basic 75 encode URL. That means that we have two different keys. And the second problem that we have, that it's quite strange, but in the OBIE directory, in the sandbox, we cannot upload any ADA certificate, so we cannot test it before.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I'm just looking at RFC 7515, and it's section 414, which defines what a KID is. And it very specifically states that the structure of the KID value is unspecified. Its value must be a case-sensitive string. So there's nothing in the standards which says what a KID should be. It should be treated as an unstructured string. The fact that a number of tools basically use a hash to calculate the KID is a little bit unfortunate. The fact that the OBIE directory generates the KID in different manners for different types of certificates is a bit unfortunate as well. But this isn't a standards issue. It's definitely something that we can pick up with the directory team and see if that's something that can be standardized for certificates going forward. But for certificates that have already been uploaded and lodged, the KID should not change. It's something we'll take back to the directory team if it's causing issues in the ecosystem.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on?
Hi, Freddie. It's Roshan Daryanani here. It's really a two-part question. With the deprecation of client secret in favor of private key JOT or TLS client auth. The first part of the question is, is there a view on which would be preferred, or are we obliged to support both? And the second part of the question is, with the DCR optional endpoints, there's a put register endpoint and a get register endpoint. Could you provide some context on those, especially the get register endpoint, and where that might be more valuable in addition to the put register endpoint?
Okay, let's look at the first part of the question. Do we have a preference of one of the client authentication methods over the other? No, I think the answer is a clear no. You can support whichever you prefer. I think FAPI allows for both, and there isn't an express preference, and I don't want to over standardize by stating a preference of one over the other. I forgot what the other question was, Roshan.
Thank you for the answer to the first part. It was the put and the get register endpoints. Yes. And DCR.
Okay. So very clearly the situation does arise, or at least we envisaged a situation arising where, for example, people would transition, TPPs would transition over from using legacy OB certificates to EIDAS or QWAX or OBWAX. The situation arises where the TPPs want to change their registration URLs. They get additional permissions from the FCA and want to change the scopes that are valid. So there could be a number of things that change, which require them to change their registration record. And that's where the put operation helps in terms of allowing the client registration to be modified to reflect the current state of the client. The get operation is there mainly for completeness more than anything else. It's an operation that's available in the lower level protocol, and that's why we provide that at this level of the standard as well.
Okay, just not wanting to consume too much time, but just on that point, the optional register endpoints would realistically be transient. So once the TPPs have migrated over, would there be any rationale for leaving those available?
Yeah, they could still end up doing things like changing their redirect URLs or their status with the FCA may change. So ones that are AISPs might take on a PISP role as well, or might gain a CBPII role. So I don't think this is something that's transient. There will be a role for it to there will be a role to play in the future. TPPs might switch over from using one QTSP to another, and their certificates DN might change as a result of that. Their subject might change as a result of that. TPPs might go through mergers and acquisitions, in which case their subject identifiers will change again. So I think there are a number of in-operation situations where this will be useful on an ongoing basis.
Okay, thank you for that, Freddie. I appreciate that.
Cool, thank you. I think I've overstayed my welcome a bit, but I very quickly want to talk through one last element, which keeps a lot of people awake at nights. And you can pretty much creep up behind anyone who's been doing open banking and PSD2 over the last few years and shout EIDAS, and they'll probably jump in their seats. And one of the things that I wanted to cover off today is this confusion around what needs to be done for validating a EIDAS certificate. And really, there are two parts, or at least two parts to the question. The first part in answering that is this a valid X509 certificate? And that part gets answered by the PKCS standards. And then there's another element, which is this an is this a valid EIDAS certificate, which means it hasn't been issued by a QTSP, and that's something that's answered by EU legislation. There's perhaps additional twist in that as well that the RTS adds. The RTS adds in some additional constraints on what should be stamped into the certificate. And again, that's the third part of the question, which is this conformant to the RTS? Does it have the subject roles and bits and pieces? And that's again a question that's answered by EU legislation, but also because we are the ETSI standard is pretty much the only standard in town that describes these, and most of the QTSPs have associated themselves with that standard. It's also driven by that ETSI standard for that certificate, for the certificate shape. A lot of the confusion around certificate validation today arises because we either tend to look at the answer by looking at only one of these streams, or we mix up the two streams while trying to answer that. So the validation of a X509 certificate cannot really be specified by EU legislation. It's only specified by PKCS standards. And that means all the normal rules apply. You look at the AIA of the certificate, you trace the trust chain of the certificate all the way back to the trust root. And if you can trust the chain all the way back, then the leaf certificate is a valid X509 certificate. To verify if something is a valid EIDAS certificate is a little more complex, but in brief, what you're looking for is somewhere along the certificate chain is a certificate that appears on the list of lists, and that's paraphrasing it. Again, on the PKCS standard side of things, you want to be able to verify that certificate either through OCSP or CRLs, which means you need to have knowledge of the OCSP endpoints and the CRL endpoints, and those should be in a working state. Otherwise, you can't really validate that certificate. The RTS conformance side of things is a little more prosaic to verify. It's a much lighter set of statements to check against. And when you look at those three things, there's a number of approaches that one could take towards EIDAS validation. In the UK, at least through the FCA clarification, one of the things that's been stated is it's okay to trust the OBIE certificates or from a similar provider, as long as they have evidence that the TPP has has a EIDAS certificate issued to itself. Clearly, the FCA guidance doesn't state that it's okay to just trust OBIE certificates to the exclusion of QX, which means that you need which explains the plus sign over there, and which means the ASPSPs have to do at least one of these three things, right? So the first thing that you can do is go and trust all the QTSPs, and that's a nightmare. There are I think close to 100 QTSPs and growing. It's a large number. That's not what most SSL termination devices and software have been designed for. If you look through using CRLs, which is a little dated, but probably a lot more efficient than using OCSP for client validation, this is almost unworkable. You're going to need some manpower and some automation to make this work. There's an ongoing job of sourcing root and intermediate certificates for the X509 validation for all these QTSPs. And then all these certificates have inconsistent AIAs, or the AIAs are not machine readable, and you need to take slightly different approaches to verifying the validity of these certificates. And I'm not going to opine on which is the right way out, but then The other alternative is you trust QTSPs that you know issue HC format certificates, because the other certificates are not HC format certificates. They are not RTS compliant. There's very little reason to go and add all these QTSPs to your trust chain. Today, from the pages that OBIE publishes, there's a list of 18 QTSPs that publish certificates that are RTS compliant or HC format compliant. So your problem domain is reduced quite significantly. The ability to use CRLs, the ability to source the intermediate certificates and maintain them becomes a lot easier. And another alternative would be to use one of these approaches, but then plan for some organic growth of the trust chain. So support the known QTSPs that are there, but build solid operational processes as an ASPSP to onboard TPPs, which turn up with new certificates that you've not seen before in the wild. Because that's going to happen, and it's going to happen much more frequently. Now, the OBIE directory provides tools. It provides the capability to help build these trust chains, to find the list of lists, to find intermediate and root certificates on these list of lists, and it makes life a lot easier. And those of you that are members of the OBIE directory, ASPSPs that are members of the OBIE directory, it would serve you all well to make use of those capabilities that are provided by the directory. So to sum up, there's complexity in the ecosystem that's introduced because of eIDAS validation. It's something that we need to live with. It's I think some interesting approaches will emerge over the course of time, and things will get better. And maybe this is a good forum to throw things open to questions and ideas.
Really, I've just been noticing we've had quite a lot of chat in the chat, but I think yeah, maybe sorry, someone was just talking about a question. No. Okay, thank you, Freddie. I think Dave, we've covered the sort of, I think the section that that we're also going to cover around sort of the use of eIDAS certificates in the directory. I wondered, Dave, were there any other topics you wanted to mention in that regard?
Yeah, I suppose there is one thing we're actually going through at the moment, adding in a security consideration to FAPI 1.0, which is to do with, you know, this issue of eIDAS certificate. So, you know, so yeah, and just for the context, I suppose, you know, for people to understand this, you know, eIDAS certificates are really issued at an organization level, and they have a specific DN, you know, specific subject, which refers, you know, to a specific business and its identifier from national competent authority. Now, there is potentially an issue if let's say you're a large organization or even a small organization, but you know, who want to kind of have a good separation of concerns between potentially different applications. So, for example, you might have one application which does payments, but you might have another application which doesn't do payments, only does account information. One issue is because these eIDAS certificates are not so easy to get and are expensive, you might just want to use the same certificate for the different clients. And we're putting in a kind of advisory that, look, you should try and avoid that, because, you know, what it means is that, you know, like you would tend to think that, you know, in OAuth 2, when you're authenticating a client, then you are authenticating that unique client. And by reusing certificates and their associated keys across clients, then you've kind of lost that guarantee. And, you know, it may be acceptable risk to take because, you know, it's all within the same organization. but it does mean that, you know, a compromise at one client means that all other kind of clients are compromised, you know, using that same certificate. And just to add it on to that, that if you do decide, okay, actually no, I have got these different clients and I want them to have different levels of permissions, you then, with eIDAS, if you're using eIDAS certificates or the equivalent, you know, produced by open banking, then even if you get new certificates with different keys, often they'll have the same DN, the same subject. And so then you can still run into a problem if you're using and so this is just, you know, the one question on you know, that Freddie answered in terms of what's recommended versus, you know, mutual TLS or private key JOT. I mean, this is the only one consideration that I, you know, I would say is that yes, if you have to use these certificates with the same DN, then if you use private key JOT, you've got more options. If you're using the mutual TLS with the kind of the standard method, often it binds kind of the client authentication to the DN in the certificate. So even if you're using different certificates, you know, backed by different keys, essentially, you know, there's no difference between the different clients. So I suppose that's just something to throw in there. It's not a massive issue, but it is the sort of thing which, you know, people might not consider. And so what I would throw in as well, which I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with, but the mutual TLS spec, you know, has a, you know, really good section on the way of doing this sort of you know, mutual TLS authentication, but using what is called the self-signed method. And what that means is you know, the client authenticating hosts the you know, certificate and associated key at its JWKS URI. And that just, again, gives a lot more option for key rotation and for this, you know, getting over this issue of sort of separating out. So what it means is that, you know, and when it says self-signed, all it means is that actually you're changing where the logic is done. And I think this is, again, what I would recommend to implementers is to do the minimal level of verification at the transport layer. So just to validate that the certificate, you know, the request is signed by that, you know, certificate presented, but then leave it to the application layer to do the actual kind of deep dive checking, you know, of associating to a client. And essentially the self-sign method allows you to do that. So yeah, and I don't know if anyone has any questions, but that's probably the only other thing I'd throw in there.
Thank you, David. I think very useful. Yeah, so okay, I see some questions and answers not directly related to that, but in the chat. But please do keep an eye on the chat, guys. I just in the interest of time, again, I would like to move on. Joseph, are you online?
Yeah, I'm here, Chris.
So Daniel, can we hand over to Joseph? Joseph's now going to give us a demo of the conformance tool and an overview of the FAPI certification process.
There we go.
Thanks, Daniel.
Oh, I think I'm having the same problem with Dave with system permissions. I think GoToMeeting must have changed something, as I've been able to do this before.
Yeah. See, they keep changing their security profile, don't they?
It's
sorry.
GoToMeeting and Apple. Joseph, do you want me to present? I mean, just the slides?
Let me just try restarting and see if I can get this to work. Sorry, just give me a minute.
Maybe, Nat, are you able to give an overview of the certification process, maybe while Joseph's preparing the demo? Oh, Nat's gone there. No, yeah, hi.
Sorry, Daniel, could you try again, please?
Oh, we're back.
Yeah,
Sure, just one moment. Did it work?
Yeah. It's getting further at least. got the right slides open, which isn't helping. Sorry, just give me a minute.
This sounds like a good time for me, Don Thibault, to talk a bit about OpenID Foundation. We're holding a series of workshops, not only with the OBIE folks, but also in North America with the Financial Data Exchange.
I think we've got it.
Good.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. So,
just let me finish my commercial, Joseph, and then you can. So we have workshops planned in the future, further workshops with OBIE as well as the FDX in North America. And we're also looking at a similar type of workshop with our colleagues in Australia. So be mindful of the FAPI work group page on the OpenID Foundation's website, and that and our calendar will give you more information about further workshops like this. Back to you, Joseph.
Cool, thank you, Don. So I'm going to talk a bit about the OpenID Foundation certification program and do a quick demo of the Conformance Suite as well, and talk about some of the more detailed parts of the Conformance Suite in terms of what security checks it does and some of the interoperability checks it does as well. So a quick introduction to me first, as some of you won't know me. I'm the CTO at fintechlabs.io. I'm the lead developer on the OpenID Foundation certification suite. Generally, I've been in the software engineer and architecting space for over 25 years. I'm quite heavily involved with the various OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 working groups. Lots of experience with mobile apps as well, which helps with some of the overlap we've seen of late. And I've worked with a lot of the UK banks, helping them actually get through the OpenID certification tests and getting their systems into compliance. So yeah, that's just recovering what I said. That's what we're going to cover today. So the OpenID certification program, it's a self-certification program. It's been around for 5 years now. It's a very kind of open certification program where all the results are made publicly available so that anybody can look and see what other people have done when they've certified and check that they are actually compliant and see how they have implemented the spec if there are choices in the spec. There's a list of the certified implementations and deployments on the OpenID website. There is, of course, a cost to the certificates, but it's particularly reasonable, particularly if you join up the OpenID Foundation as a member. 485 certifications to date, which is a pretty good achievement for 5 years, really. FAPI itself is newer, so we've only got 30 FAPI certifications so far, but I know there's an awful lot of people that have FAPI certifications in progress and should be getting published over the next month or two. The FAPI program itself originally started at the end of 2017 within Open Banking UK, as they were the first adopters of the FAPI spec, as we've heard from Freddie. The official FAPI testing for authorization servers as OpenID Foundation launched in April 2019, so that's been going over a year now. The testing for TPPs or relying parties, yeah, that's been going about a year now. And we also have tests for FAPI-CIBA that launched later last year, CIBA being the decoupled approach that I believe Dave mentioned earlier. The tests have optional support for Open Banking UK's intent lodging mechanism so that you can run against a live production Open Banking UK server. They have support for the Australian consumer data rights things because they have a very light profile of FAPI with a few requirements, like they require signed ID, encrypted and signed ID tokens. So we have an option for people to be able to test live systems that are compliant to the Australian consumer data rights, and the tests also support testing app to app, which is where if the user's on a mobile device, then the authorization at the bank side can be done in a mobile app using biometrics instead of users having to mess around with remembering usernames and passwords, which tends not to work out very well for the users. So the core goals of the program are interoperability. Interoperability obviously gets much more of an issue, as I think open banking in the UK now have 63 different banks live, something like that. And I think well over double that number of TPPs. So if you do the number of maths on the total number of connections there are between those two sets of organizations, it's a rather large number. And if you don't actually run some interoperability tests on each side, then you get into a complete nightmare of trying to make tweaks for each of the 63 banks and so on, and it ends up chewing a lot of support time up for everyone. Key goal is obviously to make sure that FAPI's security requirements are actually implemented, as well as we can test in a kind of automated test. And a particular problem that people run into is many of the banks have picked vendors that are already FAPI certified, but it's still in some cases a little bit of a challenge to actually correctly configure those vendor products so that they are FAPI compliant in your actual deployment. So that's why we've got the suite able to run against production Open Banking UK service, so that you can actually check your exact production environment and be confident that it is compliant with the specs, and that TPPs are going to be able to interoperate it without bombarding your support desk with questions. So yeah, this slide makes the point against support costs again, and yeah, we have seen a lot of cases now where if both the TPP and the bank have certified, then when the two actually try to work together, they just work. You don't have this whole backwards and forwards of, I got this weird error message that doesn't tell me what's actually gone wrong. Can somebody dig through logs to tell me what's I need to do differently? And yeah, it's not a pleasant experience if you go that route. All the compliant implementations get published on the OpenID website. It's something you can refer to if you get questions from government regulators about whether you're actually compliant with the specs you say you're complying with or not. There are a few banks around that are claiming to be FAPI compliant, but don't appear to have the evidence to actually back that up at the moment. And of course, what we've also found is that as banks have run these tests, they have actually picked up real security problems in banks' production systems that the banks were apparently unaware of. So it's definitely a good idea to run the tests against your own systems if you're a bank, because these are the kind of tests that anybody can run against your systems, and it's probably embarrassing if they find a security flaw in your configuration that they then publicize. So the tests themselves are completely open source, they're public, anybody can run them with no charge. The OIDF has a certification program that allows you to publish your self-certification. It's a fairly lightweight problem it's a fairly lightweight system where we're just essentially verifying that you've correctly run the tests, that you've understood what you've done, and you jump through the right hoops to just pull together the evidence you need to show that you're compliant. The tests are very much developed by us in conjunction with the working groups. We take a lot of input from the working groups as to what should be tested, what shouldn't be tested, if particular things should or shouldn't fail a test, and that kind of thing. And the testers that are engaging with our certification program, they get direct support from the certification team, who are all experts in the various specs involved, and we also have access to the underlying spec authors if we need to get clarifications about the actual original intent of specs. The program's won a number of awards. It's got good international recognition. The OpenID Foundation has good recognition. So I think it does give you a good stamp of approval that you are doing the right thing. We do maintain and update the tests. As Dave was talking about, there are new versions of FAPI that are up and coming. I think Matt also referenced the kind of trying to move FAPI into the final version of the specification, that there will be just a couple of tweaks to the test that are necessary to bring it into line with FAPI 1.0 when that just goes to the final vote. And we also look at when people find security vulnerabilities in systems, we look if we can add tests that cover those kind of vulnerabilities, and I'll talk about some of the security tests we do later. And the same with interoperability problems. We've had a lot of feedback from OBIE as when TPPs and banks have actually tried to work together, that misunderstandings that they found, or things where there were disagreements as to what should and shouldn't work, we can just add new tests that cover those things so that they don't become problems again in the future. And we also make sure that if we get testers that can't understand what the test failures are, we do have an active program of improving the output if it's necessary. And if testers do run into issues, then we're in the position to feed them back to the working groups, and that ends up improving the specs, making them clearer and easier for people to understand. So I'll just jump into a quick demo now, unless there's any questions. Okay, so you should be able to see my instance of Chrome now. This is what the cloud instance of the certification server looks like. Everything's protected by a login system, so you can, until you get to the point where you actually want to make your results public, they can be kept entirely private to yourself. So you can just log in with GitLab or with Google. So just log in with Google. Just quickly show, when you come to the system by default, you just get presented with a screen like this when you try to schedule a test. You just need to select the correct set of tests, which we've got instructions that will guide you to make sure you're picking the right one. I'll show one of the simple tests for now, just to show how the system works. The FAPI tests themselves require a little bit more configuration just because of the extra security properties. So as you say, it's just a case of picking from menus. There's help available, but gives you guidance as to which value you should pick if you're not sure. And then there's just a configuration form. So this is a very simple one. It's basically pretty much all you have to put in is your well-known configuration endpoint and some details for the client. So obviously in the FAPI case, you need a few more details for the clients because you need private keys and TLS certificates, but it's exactly the same principle. Just create a test plan, and then this gives you the list of tests that you need to run to certify, and you just go through and run each test one at a time. The test starts up, it'll give you a proceed with test button that you just hit to actually visit the authorization server and do the actual test. So this system, it's testing against a system that Authorly kindly provide for the OpenID Foundation to test our tests against. So I just log in and authorize, I get redirected back to the test suite, and then I can look at my result, and I see I get past, and if I had any failures, they would show up in this section of the test. And I'll show an example of a couple of failures when I switch back to my presentation. And generally, you can just see exactly what's happened during the test. So you can see every HTTP request that was made, every response, right down into detail, and the tests generally show you what's going on and which data they're testing for each particular test within the test. So I'll just switch back to my presentation. So in terms of a future roadmap, the suite already supports testing for Jarm, which is one of the alternative response modes in FAPI, which is generally not used in the UK open banking ecosystem. And that's not yet part of the certification program, but certainly as FAPI 2.0 comes online, that's something we'd expect to be added. There's currently work in progress to add support for the pushed authentication request that was mentioned earlier. That will be part of FAPI 2.0, and the Australian CDR is also very keen to adopt that in the near term. So we should have tests available for that before Australia gets to the point of needing it. And obviously in due course, we'll have tests for FAPI 2.0, and we'll be looking at other things like the non-FAPI version of CIBA and the eKYC effort that Torsten and Mark are leading. So I could just run through some of the security checks or some examples of some of the security checks that the suite does. So this particular example is checking the issuer, the discovery and server metadata RFCs just require that the issuer value and the discovery document follow a particular pattern. This test just checks that it is consistent. You can see the test links to the spec clauses it's testing. So if you actually click on these links in your real test result, then it will take you to the relevant part of the specification that will let you see the exact detail of what we're trying to test. So another example of the tests we do, check that the server is not publishing its private key where it should be publishing its public key. Weirdly, there's nothing in the specs that explicitly says this, so a test we didn't originally have in our list because we originally derived our list of tests directly from the spec, but it was something that somebody suggested a year or so ago, and I was quite surprised to discover that we have actually seen people fail this test, and production systems have actually contained private keys that they were publishing to the world unintentionally. So another example, we checked the processing of JWS request objects. So they're part of OpenID, and the OAuth version of that spec is very close to being finalized at the IETF as well. So in this case, what we try doing is passing a different nonce value inside the request object to the one we're passing outside the request object. So the expectation, of course, being that the server uses the value inside the signed object, because otherwise you're opening yourself up to an attack. Another example of a test we try signing a request object using the none algorithm. Obviously, servers shouldn't accept that, but it's a slightly unexpected bit of the spec that some libraries don't handle well, so it's a test that's well worth doing to make sure that servers do reject it. And there are a lot more of these kind of tests we do. So we try request objects that are already expired, ones that aren't actually intended for the server that's under test, correctly signed but with a bad algorithm. with a syntactically valid but incorrect signature, which is an interesting one that, again, we found some people actually fail that. One of the common libraries for dealing with checking the signatures on JWS, it throws exceptions in most cases of errors in the JWS, but for whether a signature is valid or not, it doesn't throw an exception. It just returns false if the signature is valid, not valid. And we found that, yeah, one system was actually failing to check that return value and accepting incorrect signatures. We try valid signatures, but from a different client than the one that's actually the authorization code has been issued to. Try with values just outside the request object, which the FAPI spec says should be ignored because they're unsigned and could have been tampered with. Try with non-registered redirect URIs, which the servers have to reject. And there's more and more of these. I think I'm not going to talk through every single one. But we'll be making these presentations available afterwards, so you'll be able to see. So this is an example of an interoperability check we do. We check the updated at time, and most of the other timestamps are actually sensible. And you can see that this OP, which was being tested yesterday, actually claimed that the user's information was last updated in the 525th century, which is a common error because people put the timestamp as milliseconds instead of seconds, and you're a couple of orders of magnitude out. But it's a good example of something that's very easy to pick up in a tool like this at the same time as making the other checks. And then there's a bunch of other interoperability checks we do as well. There's so many parts of these underlying standards that have a little bit of variability in them, like allowing case insensitivity in some places, and there's a whole set of standard clients that have variation in, sometimes they do just send things in uppercase when everything else sends them in lowercase, and we have found some systems do reject the uppercase, or in some cases weirdly reject the lowercase form that almost everybody uses. So these are all things that you get to run the tests, and then it's really showing that you are interoperable, and TPPs will be able to pick up a standard off-the-shelf library and be able to work with your server without problems. So I'll just talk a bit about the architecture now. So the Conformance suite itself is designed to be very generic, and the FAPI tests are just one example of tests that are implemented in a very generic framework. It focuses quite a bit on the multi-party and the protocol testing, so things like the interactions with the user, primitives that are built into the system. All the configuration is structured in the same way. It's all in JSON, and the same with the logging and the results. Everything's kind of in JSON objects, so it's fairly generic and not specifically tied to OpenID Connect or anything like that. The actual tests I showed the examples of earlier are just very small pieces of Java code that are very easy to understand, and you can easily unit test them, which is important because we have a lot of CI that tests the kind of a system that we know passes the system. That a system that we know is compliant with the specs actually passes, but it's much harder to test the opposite case of making sure that systems that aren't compliant with the test do actually fail in reality, and that's what we use unit tests for a lot. As I mentioned, all the configuration and results data is completely private until you explicitly decide to make it public, even if you're using our cloud instance. The whole process that we go through is very transparent. It's documented on our website. There shouldn't be any surprises, and everything ends up public, so there can't be any accusations of incorrect bias or accepting results we shouldn't. And the suite is very much usable in CI. it can be run locally just as a set of Docker containers, so you can have a local install that your CI runs against. And I posted a couple of links in the chat earlier of just the exact process of how you get it to integrate with your CI and run the tests automatically. I'm happy to go into more detail with people directly if they want to know a bit more about that. It's generally a very loosely bound system with the front end, the back end, and the test modules are not tightly coupled. There's some clear interfaces that are fairly lightweight. It gives you a lot of flexibility about what you can test. We're very consistent about logging all the input and output, so it's always very important when you're trying to understand test results to actually say, okay, this is the exact HTTP request that was sent, this is the exact response we got, here's the bits of the response that we tested. We'll try to lay that out all very clearly and logically so you can trace back and really understand what happened if something goes wrong. We've actually proved this extensibility because the suite wasn't originally designed to handle CIBA, which is quite a different protocol in a lot of ways to the OAuth and OpenID Connect core protocols. And yeah, we were able to add support for CIBA without making any changes to the front and back end of the suite. It was just a case of making new test modules. And a kind of interesting point is that we don't use any of the existing OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect libraries. That was a very deliberate decision. It makes it a lot easier to do these kind of negative tests I was talking about, where we incorrectly sign things. It's much harder to do that kind of negative test if you're using a existing client library that is really intending to be a client library, and it wouldn't give you the hooks you'd need to deliberately corrupt something in the middle of the process. And it makes it a lot easier for us to show the user exactly what happened and why. So if you use an existing library, it'll automatically make a call to the token endpoint for you, and the suite wouldn't necessarily be able to get in and log exactly what happened and what came back. And this is my final slide. So as I mentioned, the suite's completely open source. It's a public project on GitLab. The code is all reviewed in public in merge requests when we work on it ourselves. Contributions are welcome. We use the GitLab bug reporter if you run into problems. That's the URL for our own cloud deployment. So I think we discussed it earlier. Yeah, you can just run tests on that by logging in. If you want to deploy it locally instead, particularly whilst you're trying to run against your internal systems, you can absolutely do that. And my contact details are there. So any questions?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, so in this conformance suite, whenever we run a test and we have, so say a particular test is supposed to fail, but our system is throwing some other error rather than what the conformance suite is expecting. So whether that test will be considered pass or it will be failed, because in the logs it will show it as failed, right? Because it didn't get the error is what it was expecting.
So the general case would be that, you know, the protocols are fairly specific about exactly how some bad situations should be handled, generally in the interest of operability. So if your system is failing in a way that's not compliant with the standards, then that is a failure of the tests. There are occasionally a few odd cases where it may be that there's a way that things can fail that we'd not been expecting. For example, we had a lot of problems with some of the TLS cipher tests at the beginning because there's a range of ways in which people reject the use of a bad cipher. There's about, I think, 4 or 5 different ways you can terminate the connection at the actual underlying TLS protocol level. You can drop the TCP connection. You can return an error from the token endpoint having accepted the TLS connection. So there are occasionally cases like that where we need to make sure we adapt the suite to what happens in reality in the underlying protocol. I mean, if there's any cases you're not sure about, just send an email to certification@oidf.org and just send us a link to your test results and we can double check.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Hi, I have a few questions relating to the latest conformance security one. In case the first one is if the TPP is come to the ASP/SP with malformed request object, does we need to redirect back to the TPP with the error code, or does we are not supposed to do that? That is the first question.
Okay, so let me answer that one first. So it is a slightly complex area, so the specs essentially leave it open as to whether you should redirect back to the TPP or whether you should display an error to the end user. A lot of people have very strong opinions as to which you should do, and I think to some extent it depends on context. I mean, from an end user's point of view, if a TPP accidentally has a clock wrong and ends up issuing request objects that are already expired, it's not terribly helpful to tell the end user that. So I would make an argument in that case that for the benefit of the wider ecosystem, in that case, it would be better to redirect back to the TPP, and then the TPP's internal logging will pick up, hang on, we've suddenly started getting huge numbers of failed requests. We can investigate and solve it without the end users kind of having to report to us that things are going wrong. But having said that, the Conformance Suite is absolutely happy to accept either approach. If you redirect back to the TPP with the correct error code, then you'll just get a pass in the suite. If you show an error to the user, then the suite will expect you to upload an image that just shows the error that you displayed to the user, and we expect that error to not be misleading is the criteria that we apply. So the error message definitely shouldn't say something like, try again, it will probably work. It could say the TPP did something wrong, and that would be fine. And it could just say something went wrong, here's an error code. That's kind of, so long as it's not misleading is the criteria. So I think that covers that one. Hopefully I have a second question.
Hi, Joseph, can I just add to that?
Sure, Freddie.
So there are some situations where the spec is extremely explicit about return a error or stop dead in your tracks. There are, I think, and having run things through your suite, I think it does a really good job of identifying all those different edge cases. So specific to the question that was just asked, 632 of OIDC specifically says authorization server must return an error if signature validation fails. But you're right, in some of them are contextual, and it would be great to get consistency. But the suite does a terrific job. It does a really good job of identifying a large number of these instances.
Yeah, because the request object has a lot of claims, the signature is right, and the cases which I'm talking about is the claims is wrong. In that case, I'm specifically pointing whether we need to redirect back to the TPP or not.
You need to get to the spec, because there are certain bits which are specifically stated way down in the OAuth 2 specification. So, for example, I think if the client ID is incorrect, or the redirect URI is incorrect, you don't redirect back. You stop dead in your tracks. But if it's a scope parameter that's incorrect, you redirect back. So the devil is in the details here.
Okay, that is fine. The second question is about the intent ID generation. Yeah, currently, so there is a one test with the new security spec conformance suit, new security conform OIDC conformance suit. So if we generate the intent ID with the client 1, and if you're trying to use for the client 2, how we doesn't know until it authorized, how can you maintain that to say whether it is a malformed request object or it is a correct request object?
Should I pick up?
Yeah, if you have an answer, that would be good. Thanks, Freddie.
Yeah, so the intent ID or the consent ID would have been created by hitting one of the consent endpoints. To hit that consent endpoint, you would have had to get a client credentials grant. So you know which client created that consent.
Yep.
Now, if you pass in that intent ID on a authorization code grant, but pass in a different client ID, there's something really strange going on over there. And that's certainly a request that should be failed.
Okay, we should have a mechanism in place who created the intent ID.
Yes.
So, certainly.
Okay, that's fine. That's all my question. Thank you.
Okay, I think we, Joseph, thank you very much, and thank you for all the questions. There are some other questions in the chat. I think I've answered some of them correctly. I hope I have. So if I can move on now to Glyn and or Julian. I'm not sure which one of you are going to present. Maybe if you can, I know Julian had some issues.
Yeah, hi Chris, it's Julian here. I'll present to start off with.
Okay. So Daniel, can we give Julian the control? So Julian and Glenn are going to run through the functional conformance suite, which is something that OBIE developed after the security conformance suite was developed by Joseph and co. So this is really a similar paradigm, but it's to test the request response APIs. So I'll hand over to Julian. Thank you.
Yep. So hopefully you can all see my my main slide. So this is for the open banking functional conformance tool, not to be confused with the security one. The functional conformance tool is mainly concerned with testing out the open banking APIs, so accounts, payments, card-based payment issuer APIs that are sort of the mainstay of what we do at open banking. So what is the functional conformance tool? Well, it's a tool that allows ASPSPs to check their open banking implementations and check that those implementations meet the standards. We rely on the FAPI security profile as a sort of the underlying guidance in the way that we connect to the banks. And there were a few places where we actually perform a minor part of overlap with some of the stuff that Joseph is doing. So the tool runs tests against the resource server endpoints. There's a number of tests it does, but basically in a nutshell, we do Swagger validation on all of the responses coming back from ASPSPs, and we also perform additional tests over and above the Swagger. So we've basically developed our own domain-specific language, which allows us to express a number of different types of tests using JSON. So we allow, as it says here, testing of the sequence of a bunch of API calls. So we can perhaps do a consent, get a consent ID, pass that consent ID into the next call, expect some data that, and then do a subsequent call and check the actual result of that chain of events. We can, using the tool and the JSON definitions, we can basically craft any body or header that we like. So whatever payload, whatever set of headers that we require for a particular tool, we can create those as part of a test case. Also, as part of the response checking, so we first of all, as mentioned, we do the Swagger validation, but we also can specifically check for specific values for any JSON field or any header element in the responses coming back from the ASPSPs. We also, within the suite, generate XJDRS signatures and do the validation, provided that the keys are lodged with the Open Banking directory. What are the inputs and outputs of the tool? So basically there's two main inputs. There's the discovery file and the configuration file. The discovery file basically defines which API we're using, so accounts, payments, CBPII, and which specific version of that API that's under test. We also have within the discovery file the list of API endpoints that need to be tested. So as from a certification point of view, there were a bunch of mandatory endpoints for each of our APIs. So those as a minimum need to be there. Also, depending on which specific endpoints are listed, that determines which tests are constructed. So if you have a minimalist list, then there'll be less tests run than if you do all the mandatory ones and a bunch of optional endpoints as well. We also use the well-known OpenID configuration file to pluck out a lot of our configuration values and to actually validate the options when we get to the configuration. So in the configuration file, which is also a JSON file, we require the transport and signing certs. So these can be EIDAS ones, which are lodged with the directory, OBWAX, OB seals, or legacy OB signing and transport certs. Also in the configuration file, there'll be things like account numbers, date ranges for transaction retrieval, types of validation and schemes for payments, and a whole set of other sort of setup parameters that are required in order to run the various tests across the various API versions. So what do we get as the output? Well, we have the main thing is a report file, which is again JSON. So that contains test and organization. It contains a summary of the test environment, so whether it's production, sandbox, or a development environment. And then for each of the tests that are run, we have a summary of the information around that test, whether it passed, whether it failed. If it fails, then we'll basically have the output which shows the nature of the failure. So moving on, so within the well-known endpoint OpenID configuration file, we look for a number of things that we use. We sort of automatically ingest these from within the tool. So we've got the authorization endpoint, token endpoint. We look at what particular grant types are available. So we require client credential grant and authorization code grant. We also look at the JWKS URI to pull out public keys for signature validation. Then also obvious things like request object signing, algorithms, response types, supported scopes, and token endpoint authentication methods. Here's a very simple example of what a test case definition looks like. So in this particular case, we've got a check account endpoint. The method it's calling is a get. The endpoint is /accounts /account ID, which is parameterized and fed in. We've also got the bearer authorization in the header section. Again, that's fed in. We've got FAPI financial ID coming across, interaction ID, and a test case ID, which in the header always is really useful because it allows you to see which particular test has been called when you look at the logs and traces. Within the tool, all the interactions with the ASPSP can be recorded in a log file, so you actually have a full sort of sequence of all the raw data going backwards and forwards. It's not as obvious as it is in the security conformance tool, but it is available via command line options. In the expect section below, this is basically the set of conditions that are required for the test to pass. So in this particular case, we're saying that we expect a response code of 200. We've got schema validation switched on, and that in the matches section, we can have multiple matches. But in this particular case, we're checking that the response from the ASPSP has the FAPI financial ID in there. Okay, final slide. The tool's open source. There's the URL. I guess these slides will be made available with the rest of them afterwards. So don't worry about writing them down. The tool runs in a Docker container. Fairly simple thing. So simply running that command, if you've got Docker installed from your command line, will start the tool up, and then pointing the browser at the local host 8443 URL will bring up the browser interface, which I shall do now. Give me a second. Okay, so so when you first run the tool, you see the opening screen. The main parts on the left are the various steps. You've got links to particular versions of the APIs, which is useful for reference purposes. So this is just a quick example. They are a little bit out of date, the 3.1.0 ones, but in general, if you're looking for a particular parameters and things, they're a useful starting point before you go on to our the Open Banking Standards website in order to pick up the latest versions of all the APIs and the specifications. So we have the bits down the left of the specifications. The main parts on the screen are these boxes here, which are basically starting points for entering what's called a discovery file. So I'll paste in a discovery file that I've prepared earlier, and I'll walk through it. So this is a JSON file. It's the discovery model. It defines the accounts and transactions API specification in this particular case, and the particular endpoints that we're going to hit, that we're going to test. So also you'll see the OpenID configuration in there. This is against the Ozone Bank, which we use for a lot of our testing. In this particular file, I'll just show you the accounts and transactions API, but you could have also the payments and CBPII specifications in here, which would mean that you could test the whole lot in one go if you were that way inclined. So key points are we have the version of the API. We've got pointers to where the Swagger is. We've got the accounts and transactions API, and then we've got a list of the endpoints that will be tested. And so these are the ones that the ASPSP has implemented for the accounts and transactions API. In this particular case, we've got all of them. I think the mandatory ones, I think there's probably about 10 mandatory ones. Anyway, so once we've got a discovery model entered, we hit next and we go into the configuration screen. And so on the configuration screen is the place where you upload your certificates. You've got sign-in keys, public keys for etc., account IDs, and various other pieces of information that may or may not be required for the particular test that you're going to do. Hopefully, most of the various parameters, etc., are fairly obvious to most people. What this allows you to do also is to paste in a pre-prepared JSON configuration file, so you don't have to individually input each parameter every single time. So I'll just do that again. So I'll just paste in a bunch of parameters, so you can see that the form is now populated. I'm actually using client secret basic just because that's the configuration that I happen to have. It does support private key jar and TLS auth methods as well, as you can see in this drop down here. And also there's a bunch of other options that you can change and manipulate. Okay, so once you've got your configuration file, you go down the bottom, you hit next, and what's happening now is that there'll be some initial consents and things running in the background. The tests will be generated, and then we're at the position where we need to start the PSU consent flows. So so in order to run these particular tests, because there are two different sets of permissions required, then we have two different consents that we need to run. So the tool actually figures out the actual PSU consent URL required and puts all the various bits and pieces together, so that when you click on it, it opens a window. Again, going to our Ozone Bank, we go in and we select the particular account. We can see the permissions that have been requested for this particular consent. We confirm it, and switch back, close the window, and we see over here that it tells us that particular token has been acquired. Then we repeat it for the second one. We do the same, similar process. And log in, select the account, check the permissions, which are less than the other one, hit confirm, and then close the window. So at this point, we have the list of the tests that are going to be run. So there are quite a few. And we have the option of running them. This box is now green. So just looking quickly at the tests. So we have a test ID. We've got a name, what the thing's trying to do. We've got a method. So this is account. So they'll pretty much all be GET requests. The particular endpoint and the expected result. So obviously going for /foobar, you wouldn't expect it to give you a 200 of any description. And so we're expecting a 404 for that one. And for each of these tests, the various conditions and parameters are sort of varied and modified, et cetera, as we go along. So if I nip down to the bottom and click run, and then go back to the top, then we can see that the tests are starting to run, and most of them will pass. It tells us response time, it tells us response body. There's one or two that are failing, but most of them are passing right the way down to the bottom. So if we look at this last one for the failure, then we can click on here and we can expand it to see the reason. So it tells us where in the specification this particular test was testing. So this is for the 315 read-write data profiles headers. The particular here we can see that the test case title, which is FAPI financial ID header, is no longer required, and the reason why the test failed. So it expected the 200 and it got a 400. So in this particular case, the actual test it sends a request to the accounts endpoint and doesn't include the FAPI financial ID header, which was required in before version 3.1.3 of the accounts API. So as we're on 3.1.5, then this particular test should still pass when the header isn't present. So in this case, the test fails because it's giving a 400 when it should give a 200. So there's obviously a very minor issue with OZone, which is convenient, so that we can demonstrate a failing test. Once we've run all the tests, they will all need to be green in order to submit for certification and expect us to certify you. And in order to submit for certification, what you'll do is you'll then hit the export button. You'll click on the environment that you're running. There'll be a few bits and pieces about information. You click agree, you click on export, and then you basically have the report generated here. So if I click on here, then there'll be this is the actual file that you'll submit to us. In here, the main thing we're interested in is the report.json. The other files are just supporting files around the configuration that you've used. Obviously, there's no credentials or certificates or anything like that stored in here. It's just a sort of, so we've got a view of the nature of your environment. So if I click on the JSON report, then it opens out, and you can see it's got sort of obvious things like creation, expiry of the test, which is, I guess, how long it's valid for. We've got a number of fails, in this case 6. We've got information about who certified it, and then we've got the actual information about the particular test. So this is for the account and transaction API specification. It's version 3.1.5, and then we go into all the results. So we can see for each particular test how long it took, size of the response, a bit of detail about the test, the actual response that came back from the ASPSP implementation, just so we can double check that it all looks kosher. And then as we go down, we'll eventually see a failing one, hopefully. Perhaps I could just do a search, couldn't I? Okay, so here's a failing one. So with a failing one, it gives us the basic metrics. It tells us what the response code that we've got is, which is quite important with a fail, and it gives us the text of the error code which was captured. So in this particular case, we're looking at the particular invalid field message and looking for an appropriate match there. So again, when you submit for certification, then we take this file. Like I say, there should be 0 errors in here, and we'll run through it to check it. Occasionally, you can submit with a few errors, and as long as you've got a valid reason for suggesting that the tests maybe are not quite as flexible as they need to be, then we'll certainly consider anyone's points around why they think they should pass. So there is a sort of a little bit of wriggle room there, and one of the reasons why we release the tool quite often is because we're continually sort of improving the accuracy of the tests and sort of refining them based on the feedback that we get from the people that are running them. So that's basically the tool and what it does and what it reports and how it works and how it's configured. So that's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. Yeah, just to kind of, I think we'll take a few questions in a second, but before we do, just to kind of reassure everyone, I mean, this tool is now fairly mature. It's been used by quite a large number of ASPSPs, not just the CMA9, multiple brands. It's been used across multiple products for AIS, PIS, CBPII, also for testing dynamic client registration as well. So it's got a lot of tests in it. It does an awful lot of stuff. I've noticed user, whoever you are, user, security by obscurity. I've noticed that you've got some questions around the tools, saying you think there's a bug in it. It is possible there is a bug, but I can assure you that most of the reported bugs in the tool are not bugs. It's down to misconfiguration of the discovery files. I mean, it is really important that you configure the discovery files correctly according to your implementation if you want to get the tool to work. But maybe if you can ask your specific question, you're saying it doesn't support private key JOT. I believe it does, but is maybe Joseph or sorry, not Joseph, Julian or Glyn can confirm.
I guess so two things. One thing is to check that you're running absolutely the latest version of the tool, which I think is 1.5.2 at the moment. The other thing to do would be to send us a console trace with trace logging on and with the HTTP capturing on as well, so that we can take a look and see what's going on. But we do use private key JOT on OZO. We do use TLS auth and obviously client secret basic as well. So we've used and tested all the authentication mechanisms. Also, sort of other ASPSPs have used those as well. But certainly we'll take a look.
Yeah, we have the screenshots in Slack. Just worth noting that we also take, although we don't test the security aspects of the system, there is a prerequisite that there is some level of conformance to FAPI, because that when we look at the well-known endpoint, if those authorization methods aren't supported, it's also something that you won't see that's available within the tool. So there's a number of different things that you have to get right before you run the tool, because we kind of start where the security tool leaves. So we have to kind of stress that when running the tool, that it's best if you've already run and you've passed FAPI before you run the functional conformance tool.
So user, whoever you are, you're asking about who to contact. Assuming you are signed up to OBIE, you can go through the OBIE service desk and raise a ticket there. That's the best way of submitting your test results. You could post them on the Slack channel here. There's a Slack channel for this event today. You could post specifically to Glyn or Julian, and they could have a look at it as well. But if you raise that directly.
Chris, can I just, because the tool is open source and it's publicly available on Bitbucket, we also allow people that are not members of OBIE to post issues directly on Bitbucket if they require. All that we ask is that you don't post sensitive information on the issue tracker within that repository. And if it's related directly to an issue because you're a member of Open Banking, then you go obviously through the service desk. But if you're not a member of Open Banking and you are running the tool and you want to report issues, there is a mechanism there for you to be able to report issues and bugs and give feedback.
Well, I think you said you were using the Open Banking directory anyway, so, but yeah, either one's fine. You've got a number of options there. Okay, Balaji.
Hi, Glyn and Julian. I have a few questions relating to the conformance suite, functional conformance suite. Yeah. So, why the implementation relating to security is different for the functional conformance suite for and OIDC? So, in the OIDC spec, we upload the private, public key and private key and root CA. Yeah. And if you come to the functional conformance suite, and you guys are asking us to sign the root CA with the public key and private key of transport or signing, I don't understand. In this case, I override the problem. But the problem is, I'm end up with the problem where it is saying object close event in the suite. I get rid of all the problems and I came to end. What is the difference in case of security? Why it is two ways of implementation for signing or transport?
So I guess unless I'm missing understanding the question, sort of the transport keys have a particular purpose, and that's to sort of secure the transport level communication and participate in the MATLS, whereas the signing keys are specifically designed for the signatures, which are sort of two separate operations. So one advantage of having two is that one's compromised and you're not compromising both. I mean, does that answer your question? I'm not sure if it does.
No, Julian. What I'm trying to asking you is, so when okay, we have two stages in the functional conformance suite. One is the discovery endpoint URL. Yeah. Okay, if I try to put my local endpoint, it is not allowing me. I'm trying because all the ASPSPs or TPPs are using the open banking issued root CS. Is that right?
So because the tool runs in a Docker container, then the endpoint certificates that it trusts are based on the default key set that we import into the Docker container. So I think it's I can't remember what version of Linux it runs, but it's basically a fairly standard version of Linux, and we import the set of the globally recognized certificate CAs into that as part of the creation of the Docker container. So generally, when people have issues with it refusing to trust connections, it's usually because the CAs that have signed your certificates aren't in the default bundle that gets installed into the Docker container.
No, basically all the ASPSPs are issuing for the sandbox or production issued by the open banking. Currently I'm using it. Okay, the problem which I'm encountering is here for the functional conformance suite, I get override of all the problems. All the redirect URI is generating and I'm getting the object close event error when you're trying to launch the UI screen.
I mean, it's difficult to diagnose. I mean, part of it depends on the environment that that you're running in locally and any specific lockdowns and restrictions that you have over your local network. So for instance, we've had people run the tool in quite strange containers that have very restricted network access and often have to do things like use Docker proxies and all sorts of weird constructs in order to actually get out and get out of the container properly. So it might be a local issue in that area that you're facing.
Can I ask you one favor? Instead of localhost 8443, can we change that host to functional conformance suite 8443?
So my understanding is that that's to do with how you configure your redirect URIs, and so when we do all the testing, we redirect to localhost because that way you can basically run the thing from anywhere rather than having to configure a specific DN. I can say that it's not something that I've tried. I mean, you could just try creating a redirect certificate and registering it with your ASPSP with that particular URL in, and then in theory, I guess it should work. It's about having that registered with the ASPSP such that when the redirect happens, it goes to the right place. When we tell people how to configure the tool, we always use the local host one. But again, if you can register the appropriate certificate with your ASPSP, then I guess it should just work because that's the whole point of the thing.
It's worth stating at this point. I mean, these are the kind of things that ideally can be addressed through a ticket on the open banking support group.
Oh, yep. I have the detailed log with the debug level, and I can send you guys. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to run into the local environments of before going to test it prod. So we are encountering some problems. I can send you the mail. It's fine. Thank you, Julian, and thank you.
Okay.
Okay. I think I want to move this on now, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Julian and Glenn, and thank you everyone who's kind of who's asked questions. You also, just to repeat in the chat, many of the links are now in the chat. I think some of them are in the Slack as well. But I will ask Daniel if we can get the presenters, if they can send to Daniel, maybe we can get those links emailed out to people as well, in case they've left the chat now. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm hand over back to Don now, who can kind of round up for us, and then we can take any further questions.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks again to the organizers of the OAuth Security Workshop. This has been a great venue for both the OpenID Foundation and the Open Banking Implementation Entity, and earlier, the Financial Data Exchange, to do a deep dive into not only FAPI, but the attendant issues of interoperability, which are both a function of the standard itself, but also the certification test suites that surround it. So it's the OpenID Foundation's intention to continue these workshops with different communities of interest, certainly on an ongoing basis with our colleagues at the Open Banking Implementation Entity, as well as our colleagues in North America with the FDX. We also hope to do a similar workshop with Asia-Pac friendly time zones with our colleagues in Australia. So if you have an interest in those workshops or you'd like to suggest other workshops in that regard, please feel free to contact me at Don, D-O-N, at OIDF.org. We really do want to take advantage of the expertise in this audience to do what we can, not only to make FAPI 2 as robust as possible, as internationally interoperable as possible, but we also want your input to make its certification suite as responsive to changing demands on a global basis. So again, this is an open invitation to not only participate in the FAPI working group, to help us test the test
as we move to FAPI 2. And also an invitation to join the foundation, either as an organization or as a member. In each case, your participation is valued, member or not, organizational member or not. But these are important times for your input to help shape these standards and the certifications that follow them. I'm happy to answer any questions about the foundation or the working groups. And Chris, if you've got any other comments, feel free to join in.
Thanks, Don. Well, first of all, just I think really to thank everyone again for organising this and everyone for attending. Yeah, just to kind of reiterate what Don said and what Nat started out with as well. You know, this is I think it's really important that we try and get everyone on the same page here. That there's a hell of a lot of people who've put a lot of work into this, both members of the OpenID Foundation, participants in the UK ecosystem, both vendors, third parties, ASPSPs, banks. There's a lot of people who put a lot into this, and my kind of general sort of guidance on all of this is, let's not try and reinvent the wheel. Let's all try and build to the same standard. If there are things that need improving in the standard, or people have got suggestions, feed them in, whether it's the OpenID Foundation, the FAPI profile, whether it's the UK Open Banking Standard, whether it's the Conformance Tools. We really do want to hear from you all. Please feed in any comments, questions, suggestions you've got. Just kind of don't if you're operating in multiple markets and you have an influence there as well, then please repeat my message, which is don't try and reinvent the wheel all over the place. And hopefully what we will get to is Nat's starting vision of this holy grail. We all really want to try and be working on the same standard here, or the same set of standards. But it's down to everyone here to really help us do that. So thank you, and that was kind of my main message.
I'll leave the last words to the chairman of the board of the OpenID Foundation and one of the co-chairs of the FAPI working group. But before Nat provides his comments, I did want to say that one of the great strengths of the FAPI working group, and it's demonstrated in the Conformance Suite, is its diversity. And we have technical domain experts, industry experts from all over the world contributing to the FAPI Conformance Certification Suite and the standard itself. And it's out of that diversity of input that we think we really have the robust standard that's going to be useful to all of you in your implementation decisions and architecture decisions in the coming years. So these standards are only as good as their adoption. Their adoption is only as good as their trustworthiness. And we think that the certification suite, the diversity of input, and the ongoing contributions of people like you make this a benefit for all. Nat, any final thoughts?
Well, I just want to thank all the organizers and all the people who attended this workshop. I think it was a very, very productive one. And also, I'd like to stress once more that joining force for the common cause to save the cost and accelerate the progress in this kind of standardization setting is really important, especially in this kind of COVID-ridden remote main kind of era. So I'd like to ask everyone to come together either at the open banking implementation entity or at the OpenID Foundation. We're just finalizing FAPI 1.0. We are creating in the process of making of FAPI 2.0. Please come and join us and let us work together.
Hi, Chris. Can I give you one? Can I say one thing relating to the issues which we not covered in the functional conformance suit?
Of course.
Relating to the 4xx errors, there is no clarity between the functional conformance suit errors which we are covering and the TPP which is rising to the ASP/SPs. Yeah. Can we send some of the cases? How does these actually the issues which I'm talking is not covered in the functional conformance suit actually, because it is not possible as well. In that cases, what we are returning and how TPPs are compromising, how they are complaining. Can we send some few cases what we are not covering from the spec?
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got any thoughts, suggestions, as I said before, we're very, very happy to listen. I mean, one of the things very specifically we are doing is looking at on the OBIE service desk. We're looking at all of the tickets that have been raised by TPPs against ASP/SPs and looking to see if there are opportunities for further tests. It's a joint thing between us and the OpenID Foundation. We've been looking at that to see, are there things that TPPs commonly have an issue with that there's a missing test or an opportunity for an additional test? It's something we're very interested in. So please do let us know if you have any suggestions. Absolutely.
Sure, Chris. Thanks.
The same goes for the FAPI conformance tool. If there's anything that's in scope there that you think we could test, then please do email the certification team or raise it in our issue tracker and we'll have a look at it. There are some things we're already aware of that we will be adding some extra tests to cover, like I think some ASPs have struggled to accept IPv6 addresses in the ex-FAPI something header, and obviously that's something that has to be accepted, so we'll add tests for things like that that people bring to our attention.
Okay, I think we've maybe finished 7 minutes or so early, so I don't think
not without exhausting our audience first. So
we've managed to keep most of you online. So thank you very much for that.
Indeed,
we are very efficient.